thank all the veterans who are watching or not, all veterans, those 1% of our country who, with their families, sacrifice so much for the other 99% of us. Our son, Nate, was one of those 1%, and he is buried in Arlington National Cemetery. And his burial there is what started my interest in the cemetery. And 2014, I was asked to give a presentation to a local 8th grade group. Many 8th grade groups in New England anyway, traveled to D.C. for their spring break, and they all visit the cemetery. So I developed this talk for them to orient them. And half of it is the history, the very interesting, complex history of what I consider America's most hallowed ground. And then the other part of it is more of Nate's personal story, and hence the title, Every Grave Tells the Story. And these 8th graders going in a normal year would be among some 4 million visitors to the cemetery. It is on about 630 acres, and there are some 400,000 graves in the cemetery. So I want to orient people and then tell some personal stories. And the most important thing in orienting people to the cemetery is this building up here. And for some reason, my slide is, oh, there we go. That building up on that hill where the arrow is Arlington House. Most people who visit the cemetery aren't aware of what that is and the importance of Arlington House. We'll be returning to Arlington House. And then down in the bottom screen, Nate's grave and his buddy, Mike Koch, they're buried together, and more on them later. So the big picture of the cemetery's location, it's important to see this. There's the cemetery on the left, the Potomac River in the middle, and on the right, a portion of the District of Columbia, but a very important portion. So this is the visitor center that people come into, and that big white area is parking. For most people, they cannot drive a car in. Some people like us are allowed a car to come in with a pass. So there's the visitor center. This is Arlington House up on this area. It's up on high ground, as you will see. This is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Most people who come to the cemetery visit the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. In my opinion, more should visit Arlington House. This is section 60, where Nate is buried, and those veterans from the post 9/11 wars who chose to be buried at Arlington are almost all buried in section 60, not all. This is the Pentagon, which, as you'll see, this location very close plays a big role in this story. This is Memorial Bridge that connects the cemetery to DC. This is the Lincoln Memorial. So you can see that line from the Lincoln Memorial. It's almost a direct line up to Arlington House. This is the Washington Monument. So very close. These things are very close to the cemetery. And this is the White House. So there's a lot going on in this small space. What I try to do for these 8th graders is give them a little bit of information on how to read the gravestones. If you go to the cemetery up on that high ground by Arlington House, the older parts of the cemetery, there are many of these fairly big markers. All of them, I believe, are officers. This is a monument put up by Montgomery Meigs family. Meigs will play a big role in this story. You can see an obelisk in the background, a lot of big stuff. Not all officers had big egos. This is the grave simple grave of General Pershing, who was the leader of the American Expeditionary Force, World War I, and one of only two people to be awarded the title of General of the Armies. The other was George Washington. So you can see a simple marker, and most of the markers down in section 60 are simple like this. There's Nate's marker. So you can see there, he chose to have a Christian faith indicator. SOC is his rating, Special Operator Chief. US Navy, his birthday, his death date. BSM, you'll see a lot of those indications. That's a Bronze Star medal. He had two of them. You can see the two, V with Valor, Purple Heart, and then Operation Iraqi Freedom down at the bottom, the theater where he was killed in action. Up on top, you see some little polished stones. You can see a lot of those in the cemetery. That's something of a tradition. And down below, little gifts people drop off. This is Captain Khan, who's buried very close to Nate and Mike, an Army captain, an American hero who happened to be a Muslim. And there's the star and crescent, his choice of his faith marker. Here's another veteran, died in 2002, Bronze Star, Army Private First Class, World War II, but he chose to have a different faith marker, a Wiccan. And in our country, the First Amendment allows any person to follow any faith without any interference. And so you have markers for Wiccans, witches, all kinds. There's a booklet you can get online of all the various faith markers you will find in the cemetery. Now, Arlington National Cemetery, in my opinion, follows the course of some central events in the history of America writ large and plays a role in some of those. So this is George Washington Parke Custis, George Washington's adoptive grandson. Custis's father, who was George Washington's adopted son, started or bought the land in the late 1700s, this big parcel of 60 plus acres across from this area that was being developed as the national capital. Around 1802, Custis began to develop the property. Now, this is up by the house itself, and you can see the view of DC, which is extraordinary, and it's up on high ground, which will play an important part in this history. From down below, you can see this massive flagpole and flag. In this case, the flag is at full mast. If you go to that cemetery and you see the flag at half mast, it means there's an active burial going on. So you should be aware of that. So from this high ground, Custis would have seen a lot of American history unfold. And I asked the 8th graders this question. Since 1787, we have been invaded only once by a foreign power. Who and when? I'll give you all 10 seconds to think of an answer. And the answer is the British in 1814. They came up the Potomac and they burned both the White House and the Capitol building as it was being built. Custis would have seen that unfold from the heights of Arlington House. The central story in America, I believe, is slavery and the Civil War, secession and the Civil War. Arlington House played an important role in all of that. Now, Custis himself owned 60 enslaved people. They really developed the property. We know that Custis fathered a daughter with one of his enslaved people. Like Lincoln, he freed these slaves in his will, but also, like Lincoln, he believed in colonization. In other words, he felt that African American people could not live alongside their white counterparts, and they ought to be colonized. So it's a bleak prospect there. If you go up the hill, there's Arlington House to the left, and behind the house is a reconstructed slave quarters. If you go to the cemetery, I would encourage you to visit that spot. It's very, very informative. Now, in 1831, Custis's daughter married an up-and-coming Army lieutenant by the name of Robert E. Lee, and they were married in that house. Lee, when Secession was beginning, 1861, in April, finally Virginia seceded, and Lee had a choice to make because both sides wanted him. And it was in this house that he made the decision to go with the South. And the first real action by the Union forces was to cross the Potomac and take this property, knowing that from those heights, if the Confederates got heavy artillery, they could just pound the capital into smithereens. So 14,000 Union troops crossed and took over the property. This leads us eventually in a few years to the beginnings of the cemetery. In 1862, not a good year for Union troops and deaths. The Union confiscated the property on what really amounted to a fairly shallow tax evasion case. They took over the property formally, which put it under the control of the Quartermaster General of the Army, Montgomery Meigs, who was an engineer, who was a Southerner himself from Georgia, a West Pointer like Robert E. Lee, who had actually served under Lee in the 1830s. And he hated Lee and considered Lee a traitor. In May 1864, the Congress had authorized the development of cemeteries for Union dead, and in 1862 and thereabouts, there were a lot of Union wounded coming to the D.C. area, and they were dying of infection and other reasons. So there were a lot of Union troops dying in the area. So Lincoln, or Meigs rather, petitioned Secretary of War Edwin Stanton to begin burying Union dead in the area around Arlington House. And the first one was a Pennsylvania in 1864, buried down the hill in section 27. More about that later. Now, Meigs was not happy about that. He wanted burials closer to Arlington House, and his hope was that if enough Union dead were buried around the house, the Lee family would never want to return. And so 26 Union, mostly officers, in August 64 were buried very closely around the house. Now, Meigs continued to control the development of the cemetery for a number of years after the Civil War, and he designed what's called the McClellan Gate, which is down closer to where Nate's buried, and it's a spectacular piece of red sandstone. If you ever go to the cemetery, you can't miss it. So my question to people is, how can something born of hatred, Meigs's hatred of Lee and his family, become sacred to so many people? And it's a complex story with a number of chapters. One is Reconstruction. So Reconstruction is that period from roughly 1863 to 1876, the notion of reconstructing America, bringing North and South back together, making sure there was a place for freed people, freed African slaves. So here we have section 27 that I mentioned down. It's a little down the hill, and there's Arlington House, and there's section 60 where Nate's buried. So in 1864, some of the freed slaves were starting to be buried down in section 27. And then eventually some 1,500 US colored troops, that's African American troops who served in the Union. There were some 180,000 African Americans who served on the Union side during the Civil War. And they started to be buried down in section 27, along with freed people who were called contrabands, who just fled the South after the Emancipation Proclamation and came to the DC area. They started to be buried down in section 27. So the cemetery is playing a part here in Reconstruction. Then in 1863, the Freedmen's Bureau, which was founded during the Civil War to begin to find a way to help freed people become full citizens of the US. A full freedmen's village was developed down, we think it's down somewhere near where Nate's buried, down below. And it was a thriving area for a host of families that they ran farms and had production of blacksmith shops. And it also became a haven for political activity for freed people. So an important part of that story right there in what became the cemetery. Now things changed in 1876, began to change in the election of 1876. If you think this election is crazy, that was even crazier, and it ended up going to a commission. In the fights over counting the electors, it went to a commission in Congress that ultimately decided that the election would be given to the Republican candidate, Rutherford Hayes, in return for which the Union troops would be taken away from the South. And that was the end of Reconstruction as we know it, and things went south, so to speak, for African-American people, freed people in the South. And this village eventually closed in 1887. Now, another part of the story important is using the cemetery to consecrate Union dead, and that begins to make it truly a national monument. So here we have a couple important spots. In Meigs, concerned again to make sure that this area, this whole property, would never be welcoming to the Lee family. When the war ultimately ended in 1864, he ordered that a big tomb be put near Arlington House and filled with the remains of some 2,000 unknowns in the area, recovered from battlefields. And in September 1866, this monument was dedicated pretty close to Arlington House. Now, this monument is still there. It's changed its appearance. Those cannon are no longer on the monument, but you can find it very close to the house itself. Eventually, another area, section 13, was filled with more Union dead. First, 1,000 graves in what was called the Field of the Dead, section 13. And more graves were added, Union dead in that area. In 1868, the Union MiGs, under MiGs authority, there were celebrations on Decoration Day, which we now think of as Memorial Day. But it was originally Decoration Day in May for people to put flowers on the graves of their loved ones. And this became a big event starting in 1868 up by the Arlington House. And in 1869, when new President Ulysses S. Grant spoke at Decoration Day, there were some 25,000 people who crowded around, and it began to make the cemetery truly a national spot. And by 1873, there was a need to develop what was considered really the first amphitheater that has been renovated, and it's right up there by Arlington House. So this began to turn this cemetery into something of more of a national setting, and more officers began to declare that they would be buried there with some of those big monuments we saw early on. The next chapter of making the cemetery truly a national spot is the period of what's called Reconciliation and Jim Crow. So this period of reconciliation is this period when North and South, really on the white end of North and South, are beginning to try to mend their ways. And this starts 1876 with the end of Reconstruction. But in this period is also the rise of Jim Crow, that is segregation in the South and the North, for sure. So it's a mixed story, for sure. In 1871, the War Department denied a petition by those United States colored troops to start reburying some of their dead from Section 27 down the hill up closer to Arlington House, which was the primary burial area. They were denied. And yet 2 years later, Congress approved that honorably discharged Confederates could be buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The Spanish-American War really began to change things even more. The Spanish-American War was the first war when both North and South, if you will, those sections were together in a national army fighting this foreign war in Cuba and elsewhere. And this spurred the notion of national sentiment, particularly around the cemetery. In 1900, Congress approved the burial of Confederate bodies, 264 Confederate bodies in Arlington National Cemetery, re-interred from other areas. Now, Meigs, as long as he controlled the cemetery, refused to allow Confederates and Confederate families to decorate the graves on Decoration Day. But he was gone by then, and he probably was rolling over in his grave. In 1903, the Confederate associations held their first Memorial Day in the cemetery in Section 16. In 1914, Woodrow Wilson, the President Woodrow Wilson, was there for the dedication of a Confederate memorial in Arlington Cemetery, which really must have rolled Meigs in his grave. And this monument is really something to behold, because in the friezes around, the images around, are images of what's called the lost cause. So it was purposely put there to show this lost cause, this notion of a wonderful life, a more noble system in the South. And you can see in the middle of that frieze a black mammy holding the baby of a Confederate trooper about to go off to the war. Now, at the same time, it's interesting to me, there is no monument to any of the black regiments like the 54th Massachusetts of Glory Day fame in the cemetery. And so around this time, the cemetery was becoming and continued to be a segregated cemetery until 1848, when Harry Truman integrated the military. Just as a note, the Army is currently looking at this Confederate monument as part of this overall program of revisiting the names of Army bases and other monuments. For me, this is a piece of history that people ought to see. For me, I would like to see a monument to the 54th Massachusetts placed right up there in this area of section 16 on the left of the map. That the area is called Stonewall Jackson Circle. The next important chapter is the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. A new amphitheater had been built in 1920 for these decoration Memorial Day ceremonies. And right there is the mast of the U.S. Maine. And back there is this section 16 and Jackson Square. But there was need for a new amphitheater. And the next year, the unknown soldier, the remains of the unknown soldier were brought back from France, 1921. And the unknown arrived in D.C. to great fanfare and lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda for 2 days, and some 90,000 visitors visited the unknown in the Capitol Rotunda. And on Armistice Day, November 11th, which we now celebrate as Veterans Day, there was a large procession that crossed over from DC over to Arlington Cemetery for, there's the foundation being built in preparation for the tomb. There's the ceremony held pretty much at the spot of the tomb right now. You can see the crowd is below at that point. And President Harding was there, and Pershing and foreign dignitaries for the dedication of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in front of 5,000 people. Now, the interesting thing is that very quickly the tomb became probably the most important destination in the cemetery. Well, with the crowds, people coming on a regular basis to visit this tomb, there were commercial interests. So photographers hung out and got in front of people and said, "I'll take your picture right in front of the tomb," and we're snapping pictures, and other assorted hucksters were selling things. And the trash and litter started to be found right around the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. So in 1926, Congress established a military guard to protect the tomb and for silence and respect during the daytime. In 1937, it went to 24 hours, and in 1948, the 3rd Infantry, the old guard, took over guarding of the tomb 24/7, 365, as we know it today. The last piece of the puzzle to me is Memorial Bridge. So when that procession crossed over from DC, there was no Memorial Bridge. And so they used one of 2 older bridges. The one on the left is called Highway Bridge at the time, and it totally clogged up. And President Harding was late to arrive. So that drove interest in a bridge more directly connecting the White House area with the cemetery. And that became, from 1928 to 32, it was finally dedicated. Memorial Bridge, there it is as it's being built. You can see the Lincoln Memorial on the far side and the Washington Monument. And there it is now, and in many ways, the final piece of that big puzzle of areas that begin to make this more accessible and more of a national spot. So, things in place. I believe the next really important moment is John F. Kennedy's death. Now here we get the connection with Nate Hardy and Arlington National Cemetery, because, and with the Hardy family, because on the left, on the PT-109 with the sailor hat, trying to make his biceps look bigger, is my father-in-law, my wife's father, Charles Bucky Harris, who was on the PT-109 with JFK, who's on the right. And there is my father-in-law, Bucky Harris, with the camera across the front of his rain jacket. And in the background is a replica that was afloat in the inaugural parade. And by all accounts, JFK was more moved by seeing that and some of his crew members than anything else in his inaugural parade. Now, there's a story that I found about JFK and his love of the property and Arlington House and that spot. So in April of 1963, he was over for some business at the cemetery, and he always wanted to go up to the heights. So he was looking out from that spot, looking over toward DC. And one of his aides said, "Mr. President, we have to get back. You have meetings." And he looked and he said to them, "You know, I could stay here forever." Well, after the assassination and the procession that was televised, his funeral procession, the nation found out that his wife, his widow Jackie, had made a decision to have him buried at the cemetery rather than Brookline, his hometown, or Cape Cod, the beloved Cape Cod that many people assumed he would be buried. But no, he was buried right below the spot he said he loved so much. And the JFK memorials are certainly among the most visited. And the JFK memorial includes segments of his inaugural speech, and close by are graves for his brother Bobby and Ted. So that Kennedy area is one of the most heavily visited. And that in the first 3 years after he was buried, 16 million people visited the cemetery. And that was a crucial moment in making it a national destination. The next important moment to me was 9/11. It changed everything in America. For Nate, for many young Americans who made a decision to serve their country after 9/11, and for many older Americans who changed the course of their careers so they could serve their country. And hundreds of thousands made that decision. Now, what again is important to remember in this story is there's Section 60 where Nate's buried. There's the Pentagon. So it's pretty clear that American Airlines 77 flew over the cemetery and possibly over Section 60 before deliberately crashing into the Pentagon. Many of these young people who changed their life course are now buried in Section 60. So I ask these 8th graders before they go, and anyone before they go to this cemetery, what does 9/11 mean to you? Now, in this more personal story of Nate Hardy, there's a picture of Nate with his mom, Donna, at a young age, learning to fly. There's a picture of Nate with his son, Parker. He told me later he was trying to teach Parker the proper form for free-falling skydiving, and he said Parker had good form. Nate, as I tell these 8th graders, was a goofball 8th grader just like them, but he grew into a warrior on the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, DevGru, aka SEAL Team 6. There he is with his brothers, Josh and Ben. There he is in around the 6th grade, probably. And at that time, he begged to have a BB gun for Christmas. And I don't have to ask the eighth graders what kind of BB gun. They all know it was the Daisy BB gun, the Red Ryder BB gun. Well, the interesting story is not long after, on a quiet afternoon, I'm home and I hear this smash in Nate's room. I go into Nate's room. What do I see? A hole in his window and a bigger hole in the storm window. And there he is, rifle in hand. And I said, Nate, what are you doing? And he said, I just wanted to see what would happen. Well, he found out what would happen. He had to pay for new windows. Eventually, he became quite a marksman. And he also learned it's better to shoot out an open window. And there he is on that last deployment in Iraq. How did Nate make it? Talking to these eighth graders or to anyone, how did he make his goal? Well, he set goals, number one. And around that time in the sixth grade, one of his exercises in a writing class was to create his own little newsletter. And there it is. There's a copy of this daily newspaper that they all had to do. But one part is particularly important. I blow it up. Here he is, sixth grade. At this point in Nate's life, he wants to be a Navy SEAL. We're not sure exactly what prompted this goal that never wavered. He never wavered from it. He had his grandfather on the PT-109. My father was in the Pacific, Iwo Jima, Saipan. But truth be told, it was the same year that the Charlie Sheen Navy SEAL movie came out. Nonetheless, he had a goal and he never wavered on it. So I asked the eighth graders to think about what goals they have, because all these graves represent life's goals. People had goals in their lives. And I tell them commitment to goals can help get through hard times. In Nate's case, the death of his oldest brother, Josh. When Nate was in this, around the same time, his brother was diagnosed with brain cancer. And he fought a valiant 17-month battle with brain cancer when Nate was in these adolescent years, and then he died. Here's a picture of the last summer of August 92, Nate up surfing with his brother Josh in Nova Scotia, right before Josh took a real turn for the worse. Josh wrote a journal in the last year of his life, and what that reads in the front of the journal is, never deprive someone of hope. It may be all he or she has. And the notion of hope was one Nate and we always lived by. He also had good mentors. We all need good mentors. He had good coaches in soccer. Nate played quite a nasty form of soccer, put it that way. He got quite a few yellow cards. He also loved lacrosse, and in lacrosse, he had to learn to channel his anger. And his coaches helped him learn to do that. A very important experience for him. He also learned to have a commitment beyond himself. And I think all the people buried in the cemetery had a commitment beyond themselves. In his case, he learned even more so as a SEAL. And there's the motto out at SEAL Buds training: the only easy day was yesterday. We got this picture right after he made it through Hell Week. Nate is the blonde in the middle of the pack running on the sand in Coronado. Here's his graduation at Buds in January of 1999. And he's among those sitting in those seats. And interestingly enough, behind is the incoming group. So Nate was class 221. Behind is what would become class 224. And one of those people standing there is Mike Koch. Small world. I asked people, who would you trust your life with? And all of the people in the cemetery had to trust their life with somebody else as they served their country. In Nate's case, it was Mike Koch, who was from a military family, a wonderful patriotic military family. He moved around. His father is a career Air Force EOD. His brother, Matt, served as an Air Force EOD. His mother was a contractor in Afghanistan. So a wonderful family. Mike, a celebrated SEAL. And he and Nate were killed in action on February 4th in Iraq in an assault on an Al-Qaeda suicide bomb cell that a few days prior had strapped up two helpless women who had Down syndrome, put explosives under their burqas and pushed them out into busy marketplaces and blew them up from a safe distance. That was their world. Nate and Mike are memorialized in a program called Operation Hat Trick, which through the sale of hats that have the brands of high schools and big universities around the country and NHL teams and minor league baseball and corporations, we get small royalty, and we give the royalty to charities that provide direct programming to help wounded veterans recover from their injuries. This is Nate's burial, February 2008 in section 60. Now, we've tried to get back to the cemetery as close to February 4th every year as we can. In 2011, when we arrived at the area of Nate and Mike's grave, there were two Suburbans, big white Suburbans there, and 12 guys from Nate's squadron, Nate and Mike's squadron on DevGru Gold Squadron, had driven 4 hours one way to be with us and Mike's family for an hour and a half. So I asked people to think, who would you sacrifice a day for? Well, these guys didn't think twice. And they gave us support. They're always supporting the families like us. Now, the other side of this story is that 5 of the people in this picture who gave up a day, and they don't have much free time, 5 of the people in this picture, 6 months later, were on Extortion 1-7, the worst day in the history of US Special Operations, when some 38 people were on a helicopter to provide support for their Ranger brothers under heavy fire in Afghanistan, were shot out of the air. Just a fluke. A Taliban person saw this helicopter and shot that helicopter out of the sky. 31 Americans and 18 SEALs on board that helicopter. And 5 of those SEALs were with us that day. All of those SEALs were in Nate's Gold Squadron on DevGru. And this is where they're buried, not far from Nate and Mike. Nate and Mike are over on that side of section 60. This is all these markers of so many of these people who gave their lives on August 6, 2011. We visit them every year. Now, I also tell these 8th graders, this is hallowed ground, and not to forget it. Silence and respect. You'll see these markers. There's some of the 3rd Infantry, the Old Guard on a burial. They're the ones accompanying these caissons that sometimes you see. There's a picture, it's 24/7. They're notorious for never leaving their post, never. We've been there when thunderstorms and lightning came. Everyone else took off but them. I also remind these 8th grade groups, this is a picture, I pulled it off YouTube, but this is what you would see if you're standing on these stairs and there's a fence between you and the guard at the time, walking the 21 steps in each direction and then stopping for 21 seconds. Think 21 gun salute, the same number. But if people talk and too many people don't show respect, this is what happens. And I tell these groups, you don't want this to happen.
an atmosphere of silence and respect at all times.
And then he turns his back to them in seeming disgust. I also tell people, you know, every grave is a person with stories. In this case, someone sent us this video made in Fallujah in 2006. It's as close as I can get to my son now. They always had competition, the SEALs. In this case, it's the left-handed throwing contest.
All right, here we go, left-handed throwing contest.
That's my son's laugh. Every grave tells a story. Here's one last story. Nick Check, Gold Squadron, Nate Squadron, killed in action in Afghanistan, December 2012. His group was trying to rescue an American hostage, a doctor, a missionary doctor captured by the Taliban way out there. So they humped in a long distance. As they got close to the target, it was clear they were spotted. Nick was the #1 guy in the stack, and he knew he couldn't call Uber. There was no way to easily get out of there, so he charged right ahead and charged this area, this spot. They thought that the doctor was being held. Nick sacrificed his life. The #2 man behind him was able to kill these Taliban guards, and they were able to rescue this American. Now, here's Nick's marker in 2012, December. I'm sorry, 2 years later. Here's Nick's marker, and I asked these students, wait a minute, what's missing? Given what Nick did, what's missing on his marker here? And they typically recognize, well, there's no religious symbol. And I tell them, in this case, this is a case where the family had to sort out what would be on the marker. Sometimes these are difficult decisions in families for various reasons. And the other is, gee, given what Nick did, there's no medal. There's no medal. And I say, so why do you suppose that was? And they begin to think, well, you know, the higher the medal, the longer it takes. And sure enough, a year later, here's Nick's marker. So we thought he was going to get the Medal of Honor. He got the Navy Cross. The #2 guy ended up with a Medal of Honor. But you can see now there's the Christian marker, and there are some chocolate hearts that we put on Nick's grave because we're there close to Valentine's Day, and we put chocolates, and someone else may have put chocolates here. This also is around Christmas time. So every grave tells a story. There are the names of the people that we visit when we go down there. They're all SEALs except one, Robert Kelly, General Kelly's son, who I've come to know the family through Operation Hat Trick. So we visit his marker, which is not far from these guys from Extortion 17. So every grave tells a story, and I hope you found this to be an interesting presentation about this hallowed ground, and that you visit someday and maybe look up the story of one of these folks or others. So thank you very much.